Hey peeps, I miss you. Can you tell? I really do enjoy making these videos when I can get the camera and microphone to work and the internet doesn't go out. Okay, this is a research update. Not only does your subscription get you the material that I bring with my perspective, but it also affords me the opportunity to spend my days researching. And I can't begin to tell you how fun the last few months have been as I have begun to develop a thesis regarding the development of early Christianity. Let me tell you what I'm doing. I think I'm the first person to do it. I know I'm the first person to do it, in fact. So what I'm doing is I am using the anthropology of the mimetic theory, that is the scientific aspect of Rene Girard's mimetic theory, that which we can show has congruence scientifically, evolutionarily, culturally, archaeologically, literarily, etc. All the phenomenon that the scientists are working with. Now, I'm taking that approach, and what I'm doing is I'm asking about the question of the relationship of violence and the sacred. That's all I'm doing, okay? And that's Rene's big book from 1972. And it's the first atheistic theory of religion because it's the first theory of religion that does not presuppose transcendence, but instead argues how we humans created the category of gods. That's very powerful stuff. And with what I consider to be the scientific validation of the hypothesis in so many ways, it seems significant to me that it's that very mechanism that God enters, that is our broken categorizing of what constitutes a God, what makes a God out of our victims, how we divinize them. And it's that process that God enters in Calvary, as we've seen over and over again in the way the gospel and myth are connected in structure, and yet how different they are in the revelation of what's happening with the victim. So we know all of this, and what I'm doing is I'm going back to the early church, and I'm asking about this in relation to the big question of the early church, and that's the Gentile mission. That is, how do we as Jewish Christians come to terms with the fact that the Gentiles are to be brought in. And of course, you have varying frames of reference with regard to this. And as John Painter has pointed out in his fantastic book called Just James, the problem with the book of Acts is that it mishmashes these various strategies and theological agendas in terms of going out to the Gentiles. And there were basically three approaches. The first approach is that of the James tradition, the family tradition there, certainly to be supported by, I would suggest, a fair number of Pharisees and those of a scribal nature in Jerusalem. And that tradition is absolutely pro-circumcision, pro-kosher, and pro-Sabbath keeping when it comes to the conversion of the Gentiles to Christianity. The Gentiles have to be circumcised, they have to keep kosher, they have to honor the Sabbath in order to be considered part of the people of God. Because remember, that's how you assimilate Gentiles in. And so that's the first approach. The second, we see in the Peter tradition, the 12. And again, I'm going to, when we get to the third, you'll begin to see how Luke tends to mishmash them all up, some 100 years later, well, 80 years later at any rate, several generations after this all takes place. The second is the Peter tradition, which originally is highly influenced by the James tradition. But at some point, Peter becomes liberalized, and we do see this in Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he says Peter was eating with the Gentiles. Okay, so Peter's not keeping a kosher table, and that means he's eating Eucharist with the Gentiles. Okay, this is important. Not just meals, but also the Lord's meal. And of course, after the men from James come, Peter backs off. Well, there is evidence that Peter makes a turn to the more radical perspective of Paul, which is that the law cannot be considered at all for the Gentiles to be something that has to be kept in any way, shape, or form, any of it, period, and a sentence. And it's this position that Peter will end up coming to in the 50s, because Peter will be perceived as a traitor by Jewish Christianity, in some sects of Jewish Christianity. And Paul, of course, is seen as the Antichrist. But you have these three approaches to mission in the early church with regard to the Gentiles. And each of these carries with them degrees of the sacrificial and the non-sacrificial, okay? The first thing, and I noted this in a video a month ago or so, with regard to the ethical component of non-retributive relationships, the gospel, the didache, the teaching, across the board, it doesn't matter where you're at in Jewish Christianity, across the board, that's sine qua non. It's absolutely there, okay? And I suggested that this, I say to you, love your enemies, logic is precisely, it's the degree of that you see in Christianity. To what degree do we see the love of enemy being worked out? And I think we, of course, see it being worked out most clearly in the Apostle Paul. And that radical awareness that the Gentiles are not the enemy, but we also see that in the historical Jesus. Now, there is something, well, there's a lot of things to mention here, but one of the things that I've been working on, of course, has to do with gospel origins and the relationship between the gospels, commonly known as the synoptic problem, and many of you have dealt with this and wrestled with this and perhaps even studied it. As I've said previously, I'm familiar with a lot of different theories on the synoptic relationships. I've done a lot of work in various approaches, methodologies, from various arguments related to order, arguments related to language, arguments related to Semitisms and whether or not phrases, Greek, the Greek text can be evidences, the Palestinian Jewish Christian tradition, or certainly the historical Jesus who spoke Aramaic and Hebrew, as well as Greek. And there is so much and so many theories. I mean, here we are, 300 years. It's an amazing thing. Just stop and think about this for a moment. Here we are, 300 years into the Enlightenment, and historical research. We still can't sort this shit out, man. It's hilarious. I mean, and you could spend a lifetime on this, and everything's a theory. And does it really matter in the long run? Not really. I mean, no. It's work. It adds to human knowledge. But is it essential for salvation? No. But what this kind of work does do is it allows us to begin to read the biblical text through a lens that is very cross-shaped. And it is that cross-shape, that is that absence of God in this act of violence that is certainly perceived as sacred violence by the crowds and by the Sanhedrin and by Caiaphas. It's the absence of God in the Passion narrative that creates for us this complete disjunction that the Apostle Paul finally recognized was the hidden work of God in forgiving us. We were being forgiven. And of course, we have that lovely saying in the Lucan Gospel that is repeated over and over. Elegant is an imperfect there. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So within the early church, you have these varying degrees of a relationship to the question of sacrifice, to the question of temple. Mark's view of the relation of Jesus to the temple is going to be different than that of Matthew. And again, a little different. Matthew will be different than Mark and Luke and John. So one of the things that I've been working on is this hypothesis. I've actually taken two hypotheses and I've put them together. I've taken the first hypothesis of James Edwards, which is his book on the Hebrew Gospel and the development of the Synoptic tradition, which I think makes quite an excellent case for the use of the Hebrew Gospel in the first edition of the Gospel of Luke. And that's where this Lucan writer, whether it's the associate of Paul or not, is difficult to say. I kind of don't think so, but this writer has taken this Hebrew Gospel and Mark and chunked them together. We've noticed how this writer chunks things. And I think there's a lot to be said for what's called a Proto-Luke hypothesis on two levels. First, if indeed Luke produces a gospel that begins in chapter 3 without the infancy narratives, and it includes the Hebrew Gospel and the Gospel of Mark, we can then begin to see the possibility of where Marcion got his gospel. He didn't cut out the infancy narratives or the Emmaus narrative. That was the form of the gospel that he received from Luke, and that there's going to be a later edition that includes those infancy narratives as well as the Emmaus narrative at the end, and perhaps a few other editorial corrections in the gospel itself. Second, in addition to Marcion having that, it would make sense to suggest that Luke's first edition, which is a combination of the Hebrew Gospel and Mark, is written to strengthen the case of Mark, which is written in Rome, which now I'm going to bring a second hypothesis in, and that's Pearson Parker in his book, The Gospel Before Mark. That's the book that I've really enjoyed here over the Christmas holiday. Because Parker makes a case that there is this previous gospel prior to Mark, and he just calls it K. His suggestion is that when you look at the material of Mark and Matthew and you take out the material common to Matthew and Luke, that is the so-called Q material, okay, which I don't think you need, but take that out. Okay, now, what you have is a gospel that has the material from Mark and the material only found in Matthew. Scholars call this M, or the Matthean source. That material, that is Mark plus M, is what is K. K equals Mark plus M. There's your formula, right? You do an algebra in early church history. What we find in this proto-gospel, if it's written in the 50s, is the Jerusalem Jamesian tradition. That is the very tradition that produces the Passion narrative in 41. Okay? And probably the first or the form of the two ways, the Didache, that begins to be circulated amongst the where there is a Jewish Christian mission, Sans Paul. It would appear that what Mark has done is to take this K, this gospel that's Mark plus M, and writing in Rome around AD 70 in the destruction of the temple, when criticism of Paul would certainly be at its height. And he writes this gospel and he strips it of M. You with me on this? This material only found in Matthew. Now, Matthew has come along, taken the material of K and added to it, in the older school, Q. Although I wonder, is it possible that Matthew gets that material from Proto-Luke? Not canonical Luke, not Luke as we have it, not the second edition, but Proto-Luke. If that's the case, then when Luke goes to rewrite or edit his text, he not only would have Mark in front of him, whether he knew it or not, that it contained K or not, he has Matthew now in front of him for the second edition and the Hebrew Gospel. And then I think you can start to make sense of some of the developments in the early church between 70 CE and 135. That's a very, very important period that we jump. We go from the apostles in the early church to like Irenaeus and Origen, and we skip this 100-year period because it really is a task to get in and gut it out. It really is quite a task. And what I'm finding myself doing is dating certain parts of the New Testament quite early and other parts quite late. And it's in that sense been fascinating. Of course, the earliest literature that we possess would be the Thessalonian letters from 41, but then the latest literature we would possess, it could be close to 80 years later in the pastoral letters and the book of Acts, and now canonical Luke. Okay, so it's certainly plausible. And so that's why I tried to show you this the other day. This is kind of what I'm trying to do. I don't know that you can read this or not. I mean, the camera's not all that great, but it's just about drawing relationships. That's all it's about. It's drawing relationships that make sense of all the other relationships. That's the key here. You have to be able to accommodate as much data as possible. That's the trick. So if you can answer the questions of the larger theories related to the synoptic problem, and you can begin to answer a number of the smaller theories, then you're good to go. The trick is to not create documents out of whole cloth. And this is where I'm going to have a problem with the concept of K that Pearson Parker designates in his book, The Gospel Before Mark. I don't like the concept of made-up documents. I really, 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 really don't. It's like the concept of Q. I kind of want to go, well, where the hell is Q? How come we haven't found like one single manuscript of it? Or there's no reference to it anywhere in the early church fathers, nowhere, unless you want to accord the Logia of Papias, where he says Matthew collected the Logia of Jesus to Q, and some try to do that. I just don't think it's plausible. I think a much, much better case can be made that what we have is a document produced by Jerusalem Christianity, K, perhaps even by the disciple Matthew, the tax collector. He would have certainly have known how to read and write. Possible, but the redactor of the Gospel of Matthew, the final editor, as it were, or the one that's going to bring together K, that is Mark plus M, with either Q or Proto-Luke, this writer's a scribe. This writer knows Jewish tradition just as well as the writer of the fourth gospel or Paul. And there's all manner of allusions and hints all over the place to Jewish tradition in that gospel, as we saw just looking at the birth narratives. So in looking at these relationships in this development of early Christianity, I want to bring my Mimetic theory to the table and ask now, each of these documents, the 27 apostolic documents we have, has a relationship to sacred violence in one form or another. Question: can we see these documents engaging each other over that very specific issue? I think we can. So, for example, the K source, that is Mark plus M, is sacrificial. It's very pro-temple. It's certainly composed prior to the destruction of the temple. Whereas the Hebrew gospel, that is a text actually attested and by the church fathers. The Hebrew gospel is anti-sacrificial. I mean, it has that saying, I have come to abolish sacrifices, and if you do not cease from sacrificing, the wrath will come upon you. The K document is anti-Samaritan. go only to the house of Israel. I've only been called to the lost sheep of Israel. Whereas the Hebrew Gospel's pro-Samaritan. You have the story of the Good Samaritan would be from there. Okay. There is a connection, an intimate connection between John the Baptist and Jesus in the Hebrew Gospel, and the need to have Baptist roots and orientation. Whereas there's a disconnect between the Baptist and Jesus in the Hebrew Gospel and the Lucan narrative, which we saw as predominantly related to the eschatology of the Baptist in Luke 4. And that's where the break comes, and that's where it doesn't come in Jerusalem Christianity. That is, K, Mark plus M, if you buy the hypothesis, stems from a community that is still very, very sacrificially oriented. And you've heard me say over and over and over again that Matthew's gospel begins the process of mythologizing Jesus. It is Matthew's gospel that dispensationalizes Jesus. And there's good reason the dispensationalists are dispensationalists, because Matthew's doing this. He separates these clean periods and includes John the Baptist in the period of Jesus, whereas Luke includes John the Baptist with the period of the prophets. Big difference. There is eschatological judgment and apocalyptic all over Mark and M. And the Gehenna sayings are from M. A lot of them. There is no apocalyptic in the Hebrew gospel sayings found outside of the canonical gospels in the early church fathers. There is an emphasis on brotherly love in that gospel. And I think what we have somehow are two texts that are produced, and I'm not sure about when the Hebrew gospel is produced, but it's got to be produced prior to the writer of Luke, of course, merging them with Mark. And let's say we could place that in 80. Let's just hypothesize 80. Mark is written in 70. Now we know that Jewish Christianity, just prior to 70, fled to Pella and other parts of the Mediterranean. And they would have taken with them their gospels, but they mostly went east. So the text would have had to have been written prior to that. It seems to me that when you go to the early part of the book of Acts and you bear witness to several types of Jewish Christianity, there's the so-called division between the Hebrews and the Hellenists. But there are others. There are going to be others. For example, how would James and the Pharisees, how would they have encountered a Samaritan Christian? Particularly if that Samaritan Christian was a female, a sister in the Lord. Would she be perceived as unclean from the cradle? They're perceived as menstruants from the cradle in the rabbinic literature. How would they have handled Samaritan thinking and Samaritan halakha? We have all of these questions. Is it possible the Hebrew gospel stems from those Hellenistic Jewish circles that would have been around Stephen, that Paul was persecuting, that would eventually have some influence on the Gospel of John? There are some interesting connections between the Gospel of John and Mark and the Gospel of John and Luke. So I'm just trying to frame this whole thing out, as you can see, in terms of sacred violence. Of course, you could take a little letter like Jude, the brother of Jesus. I'm not certain about the dating of the letter. Perhaps in the 50s? It could be. Early 50s. Could be, I don't know if it could be the 40s or not. It just, the polemic is too hard for it to be that soon. But it's certainly highly oriented towards sacred violence, isn't it? I mean, it's just doom and gloom and eschatological judgment day, and you're screwed. We see a similar phenomenon in the book of the Revelation, although we see that slain lamb tradition in the book of Revelation kind of ameliorating elements of it, of that apocalyptic, eschatological, second temple Hanukkah worldview. But it is precisely the universalism of the gospel that Paul preaches that creates a crisis for Jewish Christianity, because they've got the end times divided up into us and them. Same thing creates a crisis for our friends today. Jewish Christianity has several important components. I've noted many of them in my criticisms of the evangelicals and contended that evangelicalism really is simply a form of the Jamesian Peter before his conversion, Paul before his second conversion kind of tradition. I've also suggested that liberal Protestantism takes another aspect of Jewish Christianity as its main characteristic, and that's identity politics. And I wrote that in my essay in Identity Politics, and there you'll see I make the connection back to the Jamesian tradition. This is, again, why I'm seeking to do all this work, because the thing is, there's nothing new in Christianity. There's nothing new. Everything reflects, in modern Christianity, everything reflects to one degree or another some aspect of the relationship of violence to the sacred in the New Testament documents. You got your fundamentalists that are just stuck in Jude, and they read everything through Jude, in a sense. You've got your conservative evangelicals read everything through Matthew. You've got your so-called liberals reading everything through the side of James and Peter in Antioch when they claim identity politics is essential to the gospel. Think about this. Go to Luther. What's Luther's big issue? Relate law and gospel. Go back to Marcion, 2nd century. How do you relate law, gospel? God of this just God with this gracious God. This is the dividing issue. We see different writers seeking to relate this in different ways. How do you relate Israel to Christianity? That's a big issue in the 2nd century, and that also informs doctrines of atonement, doesn't it, in the 2nd century, like Irenaeus. But you could see this in Calvin and the relating of the two testaments, the way he does it. And of course, its influence into the modern world. Nothing changes, people. All of Christendom's issues today are right there in the early church, every last one of them. That's what makes the New Testament so important and so significant, and why we have to work on all this, and how it can show us the way out. We do have a way out in Exodus, and we've been given that by the Lord Jesus in the gift of the Holy Spirit sent from the Father to us, so that when we read these texts, we can learn to read them through the lens of Jesus, through the lens of Paul, through the lens of the fourth gospel, through the lens of Luke, through the lens of Mark, even mostly through the lens of Hebrews. You could include Hebrews in there too if you wished. I mean, it is absolutely amazing, the gift of revelation that's just found in that small collection of literature, that canon within a canon, as it were, but all informed by a theology of the cross, the same theology of the cross, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. That's what was happening. Yeah, so that's my little research update. Was missing teaching here. You know, I really do enjoy it, and I thought some of you should know what I'm doing, and for what it's worth, I hope you've had a little fun here today. Peace and love. I'll look forward to seeing you in the new year, unless I, of course, have some desperate need to get in here and share with you what I'm doing again, just because I like doing it. It's just it's a ton of fun. Thanks for your support. Thanks for your love. This is really a fascinating project, and will be a very good book. I've already shown you the outline for it, so I'm just kind of gutting it out now. But yeah, we'll have some fun together. Cheers.